The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Ashley Cooper moved through Seattle General's corridors at 6:19 a.m., her scrubs still crisp, her movements economical. The smell of stale coffee and antiseptic hung in the air like a second skin. She'd worked this emergency department for 5 years now, and in 5 years, she'd learned the rhythm of how to be invisible. How to be useful without being noticed. How to save lives without anyone asking questions about where she'd learned to read a patient's decline before the monitors confirmed it. Her badge clipped to her pocket made soft ticking sounds against her ribs as she walked. Behind it, beneath her scrubs, a single dog tag hung on a broken chain. She touched it without thinking, a habit older than her civilian life, older than the apartment in Jacksonville she rented month to month, older than the name on her nursing license. The chain had snapped 3 years ago and she'd never had it fixed. Some breaks were permanent. Some chains stayed broken on purpose. The ER was already running hot. 2 trauma alerts incoming, a waiting room packed with the predictable Saturday overflow, chest pain, suspected stroke, a kid with an asthma attack. Ashley grabbed her assignment sheet from the charge nurse's station and began the work she was good at. The kind of good that didn't draw attention. Efficient. Quiet. Competent in a way that made doctors comfortable because she never made them feel small. She was hanging a second line on a septic patient in Bay 6 when the paramedics wheeled in the next admission. Male, 50s, presenting with acute shortness of breath. Chest pain radiating to the left arm. Blood pressure elevated. The paramedic report came rapid fire, onset 2 hours ago, no prior cardiac history, denies drug use, alert and oriented ×3. Ashley looked at the patient's face and stopped moving. She knew that face. Not from the hospital. From video calls. From her son Marcus's deployment in Germany, from late-night FaceTime chats where he'd mention his commanding officer, the man who'd saved his squad during a Taliban ambush outside Kandahar, the officer Marcus trusted with his life. She'd seen him in the background of those calls, heard his voice barking orders with the kind of precision that only came from years of command. Captain James Mercer. Her son's commanding officer. Lying on a stretcher in her emergency room. Bed 3, she said to the paramedics, her voice level. The dog tag beneath her scrubs felt heavier. I'll take him. She moved to the bedside with purpose, establishing for access 18-gauge angiocath, smooth as muscle memory, and began the work of listening to what the monitors were telling her. His EKG showed ST elevation in leads 2, 3, and AVF. Inferior wall myocardial infarction. His troponin levels would be climbing. This wasn't chest wall pain. This was his heart dying. Captain Mercer, she said quietly, keeping her voice steady. I'm Ashley. I'm going to take care of you. His eyes moved to her face, confused. Oxygen mask fogging with each labored breath. She saw the moment he was trying to place her, the nurse who looked familiar but not from his world. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 7:14 a.m. in his white coat with the confidence of a man who'd never questioned his own judgment. He was tall, built like someone who golfed at private clubs and made calls that moved through the hospital like gravity. He swept into Bay 3, glanced at the monitor, scanned the EKG for perhaps 8 seconds, and turned to Ashley with the expression of someone who'd just solved a puzzle no one else had noticed. This is anxiety, he said. Classic panic attack presentation. Vitals are elevated because he's scared. We'll give him some lorazepam, observe for 2 hours, discharge him. Ashley felt something in her chest tighten. Not fear. Information. Pain was data, and this data was screaming. The EKG didn't lie. The troponin wouldn't lie. Doctor, his ST segments are variable, Caldwell interrupted, turning to face her with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. I've been reading EKG since before you finished nursing school. This is anxiety. Benign. Common. Nothing more. The family had been gathered in the waiting room, but Captain Mercer's sister and brother-in-law appeared in the doorway, panic evident in the set of their shoulders. Ashley could see them processing the information, see the moment they wanted to trust the doctor because that's what you did. Doctors were the authority. Doctors knew. His oxygen saturation is 91%, Ashley said, keeping her voice measured. And he's showing signs of pulmonary edema. I think we should run a troponin level, get a cardiology consult. Nurse Cooper, Caldwell said, and his voice dropped into the register reserved for teaching moments, for putting things in their proper place. Your job is to monitor vital signs and administer medications. My job is to interpret them. These are very different skill sets. I would appreciate it if you'd stay in your lane. The family watched. The patient watched. Ashley took one measured breath through her nose, the kind of breath that had sustained her through worse things than this, and nodded once. She didn't respond. Responding would only escalate. Instead, she turned back to the patient monitor and began documenting, her handwriting precise and small. Caldwell discharged Captain Mercer at 8:22 a.m. with a prescription for sertraline and instructions to follow up with his primary care physician. Ashley printed the discharge papers, her hand steady, and walked him to the exit herself. She made eye contact with him, held it long enough that something flickered in his expression, some recognition that this nurse knew something he was missing. Rest, she said quietly. And if anything changes, chest pain, shortness of breath, come back. Don't wait. Thank you, he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he understood the gap between what she'd said and what she meant. After he left, Ashley went to the break room. She needed 30 seconds. 60 if she could get them. The break room at 8:26 a.m. was crowded, nurses clustered around a table with their phones and their coffee, the kind of normal that felt impossible from where she was standing. They saw her enter, and one by one, the conversation didn't stop so much as deflate. Bodies shifted away. Eyes moved to phones. She sat at the far table. Alone. Another nurse, Sarah, kind eyes, had worked ER for 8 years, approached with something like apology written across her face. She sat down, not at the table, but on the edge of the chair beside Ashley. You okay? She whispered. Ashley took one measured breath. I've been exiled from better places than this, she said quietly, and Sarah flinched like she'd been struck. The words carried a weight that Sarah couldn't understand, that no one in this break room could understand. 5 years. 5 years of building a life where no one asked questions. 5 years of being invisible. Sarah stood and left without another word. Ashley sat alone in the fluorescent glare, her hand moving beneath her scrubs to touch the dog tag. The chain bit into her palm. Cold. Familiar. Belonging to a medic named Rodriguez who'd bled out in her arms in a valley called San Gin, Helmand Province, while she screamed for a medevac that came 90 seconds too late. She'd never been able to save him. She'd never been able to do anything but hold him and watch his eyes go flat. The dog tag stayed with her. The reminder that some silences you kept, no matter how heavy they got. No matter how much they cost. But as she sat there in the break room, watching her colleagues pretend she didn't exist, something shifted in her chest. A question forming. The kind of question that didn't have a safe answer. At what point did staying silent stop being survival and start being complicity? At what point did protecting herself become indistinguishable from abandoning someone else? Captain Mercer was out there now, his heart in crisis, and the man who'd sent him away was already moving on to the next patient, the next opportunity to be right, the next chance to prove that his authority was absolute. Ashley stood and walked back to her station. The morning after Caldwell's public crucifixion, Ashley arrived at Seattle General at 6:41 a.m. to find a memo taped to her locker. Her assignment for the next rotation was being reassigned effective immediately. She was now working under direct supervision during all patient care. Not a request. A mandate. The memo bore Caldwell's signature in aggressive blue ink, the strokes sharp enough to cut. She folded it once, twice, and tucked it into her pocket without changing her expression. Around her, other nurses grabbed their bags, avoiding the space where she stood. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song overhead. She moved through it all as if none of it mattered. By 7:15 a.m., during morning rounds on the cardiac floor, Caldwell made his move. Ashley had completed her assessments of 7 patients, documenting vital signs, medication responses, and subtle clinical changes that most nurses would miss. When Caldwell arrived with a cluster of medical students trailing behind him like ducklings, she began her report on a 68-year-old man recovering from a stent placement. Patient in bed 412 shows early signs of heart failure decompensation, Ashley said, presenting her findings without inflection. Orthopnea increased. He's having trouble sleeping flat. O2 sat dropped from 94 to 89 over the last 4 hours. Lung sounds show crackles at both bases. I recommend we check his BNP and consider a diuretic adjustment. Caldwell didn't even glance at the patient. He turned to the medical students, his voice dripping with theatrical dismissal. This is an excellent example of nursing extrapolation. Nurses see data and sometimes create narratives that aren't there. The patient's orthopnea is positional preference. His oxygen saturation is well within normal parameters. There are no crackles. No intervention needed. He smiled at the students as if he'd just delivered a masterclass in clinical reasoning. One of the students, a young woman with dark hair and genuine concern in her eyes, glanced down at the patient's chart, then back at Caldwell with visible doubt. But doubt didn't change anything. In that room, Caldwell was Apollo descending from Olympus. Ashley was just the woman holding the clipboard. She said nothing. She didn't correct him. She didn't argue with his assessment. She simply stood there, recording his words in her mind the way she used to catalog fire positions and supply routes in Helmand Province. Information. All of it was information. By round's end, Caldwell had contradicted her on 4 separate patients. Each time, his voice was perfect pitch, not angry, just disappointed. A surgeon regretfully explaining that his OR nurse simply didn't understand the complexity of what real doctors do. The medical students learned what they were supposed to learn, that nurses are data collectors, not clinicians. That questioning them is an act of mercy. That afternoon, the break room felt different. Ashley had learned long ago how to sit in silence while the world reorganized itself around her. She unwrapped a sandwich, turkey, no mayo, exactly the way she'd eaten for the last 8 years, and opened her phone to check the news. A headline caught her attention: Captain James Mercer, commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, hospitalized with acute cardiac event. Status unknown. Family requesting privacy. She set the phone down slowly. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. But something inside her recalibrated. The break room door opened. 3 nurses walked in, saw Ashley sitting alone at the corner table, and immediately pivoted to the other side of the room. Someone had left a copy of the morning shift performance review on the table, highlighted in yellow, circled in red. Caldwell's notes from her alleged insubordination. Exceeding scope of practice. Dangerous interpretation of vital signs. Recommend closer supervision and mandatory retraining. Another nurse, Kelly, someone who'd nodded at her in the hallway for 7 years without ever speaking, suddenly found the vending machine absolutely fascinating. She fed bills into the slot. Got her ginger ale. Kept her eyes on the floor. That was when the younger nurse, the one from rounds, the one with genuine doubt in her eyes, approached Ashley's table. "I'm sorry." The words came out in a whisper. About what he said. In rounds. You were right. Those crackles were there. I heard them. Ashley took one measured breath. She didn't look at the nurse. Thank you. That was all. One word. A benediction and a dismissal. The younger nurse left. Kelly left. The break room emptied until it was just Ashley, the fluorescent lights, and the ghost of the life she'd spent 5 years trying to build. She finished her sandwich and returned to her station. On her way, she passed the scheduling board. Caldwell had updated the roster overnight. Ashley was assigned to the night shift exclusively, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 days a week. Every shift separated from the experienced nurses who knew her competence. Every shift on the skeleton crew when backup was non-existent and mistakes became catastrophes. The night shift was where you went when the hospital wanted to isolate you. It was where she would go. Access restrictions came next. A new protocol appeared in her email at 3:22 p.m., flagged urgent and signed by hospital administration. Due to regulatory changes, Level 2 critical care areas would require enhanced credentialing. New certifications. Additional documentation. Applications would take 3 weeks to process. Effective immediately, pending nurses would have restricted access to trauma bays, intensive care units, and the cardiac care floor. It was surgical. Precise. Caldwell wasn't being loud about it. He was being efficient. By the end of her shift, Ashley had been methodically excised from every position where her skills mattered. The cardiac floor where she could have caught Mercer's decline. The trauma bay where her muscle memory and instinct would have value. The places where a former Army medic's decade of combat experience in field medicine could save lives. All of it gone. Replaced with bureaucratic fiction disguised as policy. She clocked out at 7:06 p.m. The evening light was turning gold across the parking lot. In her locker, she found another memo. New performance expectations. Closer documentation of all her clinical decisions. Random audits of her charting. A requirement to shadow a senior nurse, specifically Claire Martinez, who'd worked at Seattle General for 18 months and had made it abundantly clear through her silence that she wanted nothing to do with the woman Caldwell had marked. Ashley removed her badge, set it on the metal shelf, and closed the locker door. The click echoed like a hammer strike. She didn't know it yet, but by the time she opened that locker again, everything would be different. The hierarchy that had seemed so absolute, so inevitable, so permanent, it would be Ash. The man who'd spent decades wielding institutional authority like a weapon would be reduced to something far smaller. But that was later. For now, there was just the parking lot, the gold light, and the understanding that Caldwell had moved from verbal humiliation into something far more dangerous, strategic destruction. He was dismantling her position with calculated precision, isolating her, restricting her access, exhausting her with overnight shifts that would wear down even someone made of steel. And that's when the first rail nightmare began. The 2:06 a.m. code blue came without warning. The heart monitor's steady beat became a flatline wail, and the commanding officer's chest simply stopped. Ashley was 3 beds away, restocking the trauma cart, when the sound punched through the ER bay like a defibrillator's electric snap. She moved toward the bed before her conscious mind caught up. The patient's skin was already graying, lips the color of old pennies. "Where's Caldwell?" The attending physician was already fumbling with the defibrillator pads, his hands trembling against the patient's bare chest. "Surgery. Called in 20 minutes ago. He didn't answer when we paged him." A resident's voice cracked with panic. The fluorescent lights above the bay buzzed their indifferent hum, oblivious to the dying man beneath them. Ashley saw the officer's face and stopped breathing for exactly 1 second. The commanding officer. Her son's commanding officer. The man whose voice she'd heard through video calls late at night when her son was still deployed, briefing her boy on patrol rotations and ammunition counts. The man her son trusted with his life in a country that wanted them both dead. The attending pushed the defibrillator button. Nothing. The flat line continued its accusation. Ashley's vision blurred at the edges. For just a moment, the hairline fracture in time, she wasn't in Jacksonville anymore. She was back in Helmand Province, in the blood-soaked valleys where the mountains echoed with incoming fire and the smell of copper and diesel fuel mixed into a perfume of catastrophe. She was kneeling beside Corporal Marcus Webb, the medic whose dog tag hung beneath her scrubs right now, whose blood was soaking into her knees as his eyes tried to focus on something beyond the pain. His lips moved. "Angel 6, he whispered. Just that. Just her call sign. The medevac was still 4 minutes out and his femoral artery was severed and she was screaming into the radio while her hands did things her hands had been trained to do. The attending pushed the button again. Nothing. Ashley snapped back. The ER bay crystallized into focus. The monitor still flatlined. The attending's hands were shaking too badly to perform compressions efficiently. The resident stood frozen, watching a man die on a Tuesday morning when no one famous was paying attention. Her combat training didn't ask for permission. It never did. Ashley moved into the space beside the attending, and something in her posture changed, a shift so complete that the attending stepped back without being told. Her spine straightened into a command structure. Her voice dropped into the clipped precision of someone who had orchestrated survival in conditions designed to produce only death. 30 compressions. Depth of 2.5 inches. She positioned herself and began. Her hands found the ribs like they'd never forgotten, like muscle memory was just another word for prayer. Push 1 milligram epi. Now. The resident fumbled with the medication. The attending watched her hands move with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this in a field tent with mortars landing close enough to shake the walls. 1 compression. 2. 3. The numbering was automatic, the cadence steady as a military march. Defib shows sinus rhythm at 35 compressions. The attending's voice sharpened, pulled into focus by her certainty. Someone had taken command and it wasn't him. Keep going. 2-inch compression at 100 beats per minute. Talk to me. The words came in bursts. Short. Declarative. Absolute. The resident's hand steadied. The attending began setting up the emergency airway. Ashley continued the compressions, her forearms burning with a kind of pain that was information, just data, just the body doing what it was built to do. Somewhere in her spine, a fragment of shrapnel that had been embedded there for 5 years shifted minutely and she didn't even flinch. Pain was information. Pain was just telling her she was still alive. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath. Her voice came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. And find an MRE in the supply closet. The trauma dressing kit won't hold once we get his chest open. The resident exchanged a look with the attending. No nurse said things like that. No ER nurse knew about field dressing protocols for penetrating thoracic trauma. No civilian nurse improvised chest seals from meal ration packaging. Now, Ashley said, and it wasn't a request. The resident ran. Ashley's hands moved through the compressions with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this before the hospital had even been built, before Jacksonville existed as anything but dense humidity and ancient swampland. 80 compressions. 90. The monitor showed nothing but flatline chaos. He's in asystole, the attending whispered. Not a diagnosis. A surrender. No. Ashley's eyes didn't leave the patient's face. The man's son was somewhere in Youre Province right now, probably sleeping in a patrol base, probably dreaming of home. That dream was about to die on this ER bed if she allowed it to. Push epi again. Get me a central line set up and make sure that airway is ready. Something in her voice made the attending obey. Something in the way she said make sure sounded less like a question and more like a command that had already been followed in parallel universes where people actually listened the first time. 120 compressions. 130. The monitor stayed dead. Ashley looked at the attending. One look. That was all it took. He nodded and stepped back. He knew what she was about to do. He didn't know how he knew, but he knew. She placed her hands on the officer's ribs. The thoracotomy would need to be left anterolateral, through the 5th intercostal space. It would need to be fast. It would need to be precise. It would need to be the kind of procedure that got people killed if they hesitated, and she had stopped hesitating 5 years ago when she accepted this job, when she lied on her application and said her medical experience was limited to basic nursing school and 6 months in a rural clinic. She had stopped hesitating the moment she decided to survive. The resident returned with the MRE and the angiocath. Ashley's hands moved to the scalpel. The blade caught the overhead light like a tiny silver fang. O2 sat, she asked. 68 and dropping, the attending said. His voice was steady now. He understood. He didn't know what he understood, but his body had recognized authority when it saw it. She made the incision. Smooth. Definitive. The attending was already opening the chest wall, his hands moving in sync with hers like they'd trained together for years instead of seconds. The officer's ribs cracked open with a sound like breaking ice. Her hands were already inside, moving through the cavity with a surgeon's precision and a soldier's economy of motion. Sinus rhythm, the attending said. His voice carried a note of something between shock and awe. 72 beats per minute. Stay with the compressions. Ashley's hands didn't pause. She was sealing the penetrating wound now, using the sterile dressing from the MRE package, fashioning an emergency chest seal from materials that weren't supposed to exist in an ER bay because no one was supposed to need field medicine in Jacksonville, Florida. The wound was clean. She could work with clean. Push another epi. Get me 2 units of O-negative from the blood bank. Now. This isn't a request. The resident ran again. The attending continued compressions, his rhythm matching hers, their hands a conversation happening below the level of language. O2 climbing, someone called. Ashley didn't see who. Probably the cardiac monitor tech, who had backed against the far wall and was watching a nurse perform combat medicine in the middle of the night. 78. 82. 88. Ashley's hands moved like they were underwater, like they had all the time in the world and none of it at once. The chest seal was holding. The sinus rhythm was climbing. The officer's pupils were starting to react to light instead of lying there the color of wet slate. 92, the monitor announced. 92. Stable. Ashley stepped back. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the specific tremor that came after adrenaline had done its job and was finally releasing its grip on her nervous system. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the recall from holding herself together at cellular levels. She looked down at her hands. Blood. Not just the officer's blood, but something else too. Something that had gotten under her skin 5 years ago and never fully washed out. The tattoo on her inner left wrist, a small set of coordinates, 32.74 degrees north, 68.16 degrees east, was hidden beneath the surgical glove, but she could feel it burning like it always did when her past caught up with her present. The attending was staring at her. The resident had returned with blood units and was staring too. The cardiac tech was definitely staring. Someone needs to call the OR, Ashley said quietly. Her voice had shifted again, dropped back down to the register of a simple nurse, a person who worked nights and knew her place and didn't ask questions about why she was moving with the certainty of someone who had saved lives in conditions that should have been statistically impossible. Tell them we're sending up a thoracic emergency. Penetrating wound, successful field repair, vital stable. ETA 8 minutes. The attending moved like he'd been waiting for permission. He picked up the phone with the reverence of someone handling something sacred. Ashley pulled off the surgical gloves. Her hands looked like hands. Steady hands. Hands that had held dying medics and stitched wounds under fire and now pushed medication in a hospital where the biggest threat was usually incompetence rather than incoming rounds. The officer's eyes flickered. Just for a moment. He looked directly at her. His lips moved. One word, barely a whisper, Major. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Not with the attending still in the bay, not with the resident staring like he'd just watched someone rise from the dead, not with every second of her resurrection hanging by a thread so thin it was practically invisible. She simply turned and walked toward the supply closet, her movements the measured pace of someone who had learned long ago that the fastest way to disappear was to move like you had nothing to hide. But as she stood there in the darkness of the supply room, surrounded by bandages and saline bags and all the small infrastructure of modern medicine, one hand pressed against the wall to steady herself, she understood something with the clarity of hindsight and the weight of a door that had just opened and couldn't be closed again. That word, Major, carried the kind of recognition that couldn't be explained away as a medication mix-up or a lucky guess. That man had called her by a rank she hadn't worn in 5 years, in a hospital where no one was supposed to know who she really was, on a night when Dr. Caldwell was mysteriously unavailable and his newly granted power suddenly looked very fragile indeed. And the worst part, the part that made her lean her forehead against the cool wall and close her eyes, was that she had enjoyed it. Saving him. Being herself. Using hands that knew what to do. For those 5 minutes, she hadn't been hiding. She had been alive. Which meant that everything was about to get much more complicated. The monitor showed what the attending physician could not yet process. Sinus rhythm. The green line climbed steady, climbing higher. 82. 88. 91. The commanding officer's chest rose on its own. Pink returning to ashen skin like a photograph developing in reverse. Ashley did not step back. Her hands were still moving, already reaching for the equipment she'd need next, the way soldiers move through rooms they've cleared 100 times. The attending, a young resident named Chen, stood frozen 3 feet away, his eyes locked on her fingers working the makeshift chest seal she'd fashioned from a foil packet inside her locker. An MRE thermal retainer. Duct tape salvaged from the supply closet. Field medicine from a valley she'd promised herself she'd left behind. How did you, Chen started. Get me 2 units of O negative. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and his body obeyed before his brain could decide whether to question it. That was the thing about real authority, it didn't live in titles. It lived in hands that moved like they'd done this before. Hands that had held lives together in worse places than this sterile room. Hands that knew where to cut, when to push, how hard the human body could be broken and still pulled back from the edge. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Proof. Evidence. A resurrection. Dr. Caldwell arrived 20 minutes later. He moved through the ER doors at 3:06 a.m. with his coat unbuttoned and his phone already in his hand, probably scrolling through emails, probably not expecting to find his problem solved. His expression shifted the moment he saw the commanding officer breathing on his own. The patient's color. The 4 lines Ashley had placed with the precision of someone who'd done triage under fire. The chart that showed vitals climbing instead of flatlined. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing moved in that room except the ventilator's mechanical breath. Then Caldwell's jaw tightened. His eyes moved from the patient to Ashley to Chen, reading the scene like a chessboard where someone had just moved a piece he didn't authorize. Step outside, he said to Ashley. Not a request. The hallway was fluorescent bright and empty except for a custodian mopping the far end. Caldwell positioned himself so his back was to the glass, blocking anyone's view inside. You performed an emergency thoracotomy. He was coding. You don't have surgical privileges. He was dying. That's not your decision to make. Caldwell's voice stayed controlled, but something underneath had shifted. This wasn't frustration. This was a calculation updating in real time. A man realizing that a subordinate had just crossed a line that, if left unpunished, would undermine every carefully maintained hierarchy in the hospital. You violated protocol. You exceeded your scope. And now you're standing in my ER with blood on your scrubs acting like you saved a life instead of practicing medicine without a license. Ashley's breath came measured, steady. 1 count in. 1 count out. The kind of breathing that had kept her alive in rooms where screaming would have gotten people killed. He's stable. Because you got lucky. Next time, you'll kill someone. And that will be on you. On your licensure. On your career. He paused, let that sink in. I'm calling an emergency board meeting. Tonight. You won't be present. But the outcome is already decided. He turned and walked back inside without waiting for a response. Ashley stood in that hallway for 13 seconds, listening to the fluorescent lights hum their electric drone, watching the custodian's mop make deliberate circles on the tile. The world felt like it was moving at half speed. By 4:24 a.m., Caldwell had made 3 phone calls. The first to Thomas Brennan, the hospital's chief administrator, who owed him a favor from a malpractice case Caldwell had helped navigate quietly 5 years ago. The second to Margaret Hayes, board chair, whose daughter's wedding rehearsal Caldwell had personally attended last spring, a gesture that Hayes had noted with the kind of gratitude that turned into IOUs. The third to David Sterling, the board's legal counsel, whose law firm handled the hospital's litigation and whose annual retainer depended on staying in Caldwell's good graces. By 5:22 a.m., the decision was made. By 6:18 a.m., Ashley received the official termination letter slid under her locker by a human resources representative who wouldn't make eye contact. The words were clinical. Practicing beyond scope of licensure. Endangering patient safety. Violating institutional protocols. The letter recommended immediate referral to the state medical board for potential license suspension. She read it once. Twice. Then she opened her locker and began placing her belongings into a cardboard box someone had left by the break room sink. The cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. A dying succulent in a ceramic pot, wilted despite her attempts to keep it alive. A photograph of a man with kind eyes and a smile that had somehow survived 4 tours and 3 IED blasts before the 4th one didn't leave anything to survive. Her dog tag on its broken chain. She wrapped it carefully in the photograph before placing it in the box. She did not mention that when the commanding officer's eyes had fluttered open for exactly 2 seconds, he'd reached for her wrist with what little strength remained and whispered a single word. A name. A call sign. A word that belonged to a woman who'd been buried 5 years ago in a medical discharge and paperwork and the decision to become someone else. She did not explain why her hands knew exactly how to navigate a chest cavity, how to find the pericardium and drain the tamponade, how to jury-rig a seal from the contents of an MRE because in Helmand Province there were no surgical suites, only bleeding soldiers and the terrifying clarity that came from being the only person qualified to save them. She did not say any of this because saying it would mean admitting that the past had a way of reaching out from whatever grave you dug for it and pulling you backward, that hiding your truth was only ever temporary, that one moment of using the skills you'd spent 5 years suppressing was enough to destroy everything you'd built. The rain started around 6:51 p.m., while she was still sitting in her car in the hospital parking garage, watching the water stream down the windshield. She didn't drive anywhere. She just sat with the box on the passenger seat and watched the parking garage single light source make everything silver and strange. At 7:38 p.m. she walked to the bus stop 3 blocks away. The rain had turned cold, the kind that soaked through fabric without mercy. She sat on the bench with the cardboard box clutched against her chest like it contained something fragile, something that might break if she didn't hold it tight enough. Her phone buzzed at 8:13 p.m. A text from her son's commanding officer, somehow getting her number from the hospital directory before they'd fired her. "The attending physician told me what you did." "Thank you, Major." She didn't respond. She stared at the word Major like it was written in a language she'd forgotten how to speak, and something inside her chest twisted in a way that physical pain couldn't match. The rain kept falling. Her scrubs were soaked through. She was shaking, but the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 5 years of discipline cracking under the weight of one impossible choice: be yourself and save a life, or stay invisible and watch someone die. There was no third option. There never had been. She took the dog tag from the box. Held it up in the rain. The metal was cold, worn smooth by years of being pressed against skin. She thought about the medic whose name was etched into it. Young. Smart. Wanted to be a surgeon, not a combat medic. Had bled out in her arms while she screamed for a medevac that couldn't land because of incoming fire. She'd carried this tag for 5 years because throwing it away felt like a betrayal, and keeping it felt like a slow death. Her hand opened. The tag hung suspended between her fingers, ready to drop into the gutter and disappear. Then she heard it. At first it was distant, just a rhythmic pulse at the edge of perception. But it grew louder, the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the rain-soaked night, the distinctive thump-thump-thump that made something primal in her nervous system sit up and recognize a call sign. She closed her hand around the tag. Held it tight. 3 Black Hawk helicopters appeared over the hospital, their landing lights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. The rotor wash shook the rain sideways, scattered it in sheets across the parking lot. The helicopters didn't land at the civilian helipad. They came down in the medical plaza, rotors still turning, doors already sliding open. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. Moving with the precision of people who'd done this before. A Navy SEAL in full operational gear emerged first, then another, then a man in a general's dress uniform despite the hour, his collar heavy with stars. They moved through the ER doors with the kind of purpose that made hospital staff part like water. Security tried to stop them. They went around. Caldwell emerged from his office, drawn by the commotion, and his face went completely blank the moment he realized what he was looking at. Armed military. Serious military. The kind that didn't ask permission. It took them for minutes to find her at the bus stop. The SEAL team leader approached first, and he moved the way apex predators move, fluid, economical, terrifying in its precision. He came to a stop 3 feet away, rain running down his face, and he dropped to one knee. Major Cooper. It wasn't a question. We need you to come with us, Sam. Your son is asking for you. He needs his mother to tell him why his commanding officer is alive and nobody else on that ward knows how to do what you just did. The words didn't land right. Nothing was landing right. She was still sitting on a bus bench in Jacksonville, Florida, still unemployed, still holding a cardboard box and a dog tag that belonged to someone who was never coming home. But the SEAL was standing now, waiting. And the general was walking toward her with a salute already forming, his hand coming up to his forehead with the kind of respect she'd spent 5 years hiding from, 5 years trying to not deserve. Major Ashley Cooper, the general said, and his voice carried the weight of someone used to commanding rooms. Your son reported your location to Northcom 43 minutes ago. I've been authorized to inform you that your medical discharge is being reviewed, pending full recognition of your service record. The rain fell harder. She stood, and the cardboard box stayed in her hands because letting go of it felt like letting go of the last 5 years, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. The SEAL took the box from her gently, carefully, the way you'd take something sacred. Come on, Major. Let's get you out of this rain. They walked toward the helicopters, and somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Caldwell was watching from a window, watching military units arrive for a nurse, watching something he'd fundamentally misunderstood walk out of his reach. The rotor wash hit her face, and Ashley Cooper stopped being invisible. 48 hours. That's how long it took for the commanding officer to stop staring at the ceiling of his hospital room and actually pay attention to the news playing on the muted television bolted to the wall. His eyes, sharp despite the morphine drip, caught the local broadcast cycling through the evening news cycle. Seattle General Hospital. A name he knew. A face he recognized, Dr. Caldwell, standing in front of reporters with his chin lifted like a man who'd never been questioned in his life. An overreaching nurse who endangered a patient, Caldwell was saying, his voice dripping with the kind of certainty that comes from never having been contradicted. Exceeded her scope of practice. Reckless. I had no choice but to terminate her employment immediately. Patient safety is my only concern. The officer's hand moved. Slow. Deliberate. He reached for the remote control on the bedside table and turned up the volume. The reporter nodded sympathetically. The narrative was already written. The nation of viewers scrolling through dinner plates and car rides and tired evening commutes had already decided the arrogant nurse was the villain. The doctor was protecting them. Then the officer's eyes narrowed. He knew something they didn't. He knew what his chest felt like when it stopped working. He knew hands moving with precision that had nothing to do with hospital protocols and everything to do with muscle memory forged in desert heat and enemy fire. He knew who had saved his life, and he knew exactly what her sacrifice had cost her. He picked up his phone. His voice was still rough from the breathing tube, each word a small act of will against the pain medication trying to pull him under. He dialed the number of the station that was still broadcasting live. Still selling the story that Dr. Caldwell wanted the world to believe. The receptionist almost didn't put him through. Then he told them his name, his rank, and suddenly the line connected. "We're live," the anchor said, uncertain but professional. "Who is this?" "Captain James Harrison. Currently stationed at Naval Base Kitsap." His voice steadied with each word. "I'm the patient your guest just accused of being endangered by that nurse." The silence on air lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the anchor's eyes widened and the phone line to the station erupted with activity behind the scenes. "You're saying?" "I'm saying that nurse saved my life 48 hours ago when my heart stopped in this hospital." His hand trembled, but his voice remained level. "And your guest just fired her for it." The camera cut to Caldwell's face. It was already darkening. The anchor leaned forward. "Can you tell our viewers more about what happened?" "My commanding officer can." The words came quietly from somewhere off camera, and a younger man appeared in frame, his uniform crisp despite the lateness of the hour. He was holding a folder, Ashley's service file. Official. Stamped. The kind of document that doesn't exist for people who want to stay invisible. This was Ashley's son. Major Ashley Cooper, he read, his voice breaking on the rank. 12 years of service. 3 tours of combat. He paused. The camera caught the moment his throat tightened. Purple Heart. Caldwell opened his mouth. Bronze Star with Valor, the son continued, and now his hands were shaking as he held the pages. The folder shook with them. The phone line sparked with static. Then a second figure appeared on the monitor, larger, shoulders that seemed too broad for the screen. A Navy SEAL team leader, streaming in from an undisclosed location via secure video call. His bearing was the kind that made the air pressure change. "Silver Star," he said, his voice like a tank idling in a distant garage. "For carrying 3 wounded soldiers through enemy fire when her leg was shredded by fragmentation." A pause. The weight of it. Combat medic. Saved 47 lives in a single deployment. 47. Caldwell's protest died before he could form words. On every screen in Seattle, in Jacksonville, across the nation, millions of viewers were watching the moment a man's lie became visible. They were flooding social media. Screenshots of her uniform. Her medals. Her name. Major Ashley Cooper. The nurse they'd been told was reckless. The nurse who'd saved a captain's life using techniques from a battlefield 5,000 miles away. The hospital switchboard lit up like a fire alarm. The hospital board, watching from their homes, their phones buzzing with alerts and calls from donors and press and federal investigators who suddenly had a very keen interest in Seattle General's personnel decisions. 3 hours of watching their hospital's name trend nationwide for all the wrong reasons. By midnight, Dr. Caldwell's contract was terminated. Not negotiated. Not discussed. Terminated. The board president's statement was 5 sentences long. It mentioned legal review. It mentioned a thorough investigation. It did not mention Caldwell's name again. The vindication was swift. The justice felt incomplete. 6 months passed. Ashley rebuilt herself the way she rebuilt that captain's chest in the ER bay, methodically. The hospital begged her back. The board offered her the director position without hesitation. She took it, but on one condition, that Seattle General would open a veteran support wing. That nurses like her, people carrying invisible trauma in their scrub pockets, would have resources. That the hospital would never again confuse hierarchy with competence. On her first day back in that role, she stood in her new office on the 5th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the ER where she'd saved a man's life and lost her anonymity in the same breath. She opened a small wooden box and removed 2 items with equal care. The dog tag. Bent from the weight of 5 years. The name engraved on it belonged to a medic she couldn't save. The chain was broken. She'd never fixed it, that was the point. Broken things can still hold weight. Beside it, she placed a medal. Silver. Heavy. Real. She hung both on the wall beside her desk. Not as a shrine to the past, but as a reminder that some chains break so we can finally breathe. A former colleague stopped by that afternoon with a piece of information. Caldwell was working night security at Seattle General, the very building he'd ruled like a king. She'd heard he flinched now when people called him doctor. His name tag read Steve. He checked doors that had once bowed to his presence. Ashley looked out her window at the ER below. Nurses moving between patients with purpose. Young ones, new ones, people still learning that authority isn't about titles, it's about knowing when to act. She made a mental commitment in that moment: this hospital would hire people like her. People who understood that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding it all together. People who knew the cost of silence. Her phone buzzed. A text from her son's commanding officer. Captain Harrison, now recovering at home. Thank you for coming back. We need more officers who remember what matters. She didn't respond with words. She just looked at that medal on the wall and remembered, the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because the best stories are the ones about people the world almost broke, and almost getting broken is what teaches you how to survive. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value. Tell me your story.